Hello everyone, welcome back to the Adult Sunday School lesson presentation for October 24th, 2021. It's entitled Pay Attention to His Permanence, and it's taken from the book of Hebrews chapter 7. We're continuing in our unit entitled God Speaks Through God's Son. We've looked at paying attention to God's Son's suffering, evaluation, submission. Today it's permanence. And this will complete our study in the book of Hebrews for this time. But we're looking at Jesus as God's supreme revelation, as God has revealed God's self in many ways throughout the ages, but the supreme revelation is through Jesus. And we've looked at various aspects of this revelation of Jesus, including his suffering, how he evaluates us, Jesus' submission, and today we're looking at the permanent aspect of God's revelation through Jesus. The good news about this is that access to God is available to anyone who believes. So that is what our lesson writer has for us over the last few weeks. We're looking at the book of Hebrews as, if you had just one phrase or one image about that, it would be that Jesus is better. And of course, the writer of the book is telling us that the synagogue is no place for a Jew. Good Jews belong in church. The book of Hebrews is loaded with theology. You might say it's nothing but theology. The church began within Judaism. Perhaps some of the Jewish Christians were giving up and going back to their old religion due to Christian persecution. As I mentioned last week, the Roman authorities allowed their conquered peoples to continue in their religious traditions with some qualifications. The old line religions were okay by the Romans, but the new upstart religions, they weren't even classified as religions. They call them more superstitions, Christianity being considered that, at least in the early going. It wasn't until about 300 of the Common Era that there was a big change, and the Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire through Constantine. But before that time, it was a no-no. Christians faced horrendous persecution that Jewish people, followers of the Mosaic Code, did not face because they were practicing an old line religion that was accepted by the Roman authorities. This is particularly so when we consider the Essene community, which was in the Dead Sea, just to the eastern shore of the land of Israel. And this community of Essenes near the Dead Sea, they paid particular reverence to a mysterious figure called Melchizedek. And for them, there wasn't anything any higher than the priesthood of Melchizedek. And so that's why one of the reasons why the writer of the book of Hebrews is so focused on Melchizedek. When we talk about permanence, you look it up in the dictionary, it means lasting or remaining unchanged indefinitely, perhaps eternally. So that is permanent indeed. This is a good picture that shows the change of seasons that we are experiencing in the month of October. And that teaches us that October is a symphony of permanence and change, that there's such a thing as surface change, but underlying permanence. And that's what we're looking at with the high priesthood of Jesus in today's lesson, how it is permanent. It is once for all delivered to the saints. It's not going to be changed, and it's going to be eternally relevant. So our text today from chapter 7 in the book of Hebrews focuses on the permanence and finality of Jesus as our ultimate high priest. We will see the many ways that Jesus is qualified to be our great high priest. I abbreviate that with the initials GHP. God's previous revelations of God's self were valid for their times, but Jesus will always be the final and perfect revelation. The writer of the book of Hebrews, which I sometimes call the Hebrews preacher, is indicating to us that Jesus is the heir of God's promises to David and the fulfillment of expectations associated to this mysterious priest called Melchizedek. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah through birth, and as you recall, the tribe of Judah did not produce priests at all. The priests all came from the tribe of Levi. So calling Jesus a priest out of the tribe of Judah is a unique distinction, and would cause people to scratch their heads and say, wait a minute, people from Judah don't become priests. So this is another way that the priesthood of Jesus is unique. The Jewish priesthood was not established until the Mosaic law, or the time of Moses. So this Melchizedek priest from Abram's time is a priest out of time and really out of place, because when Melchizedek is named as the high priest and mentioned in association with Abram, that's way before the establishment of the priestly cult in the Mosaic law, way before the temple. So there was not an official way to become a priest or a place to practice priesthood at the time of Abram and Melchizedek. So there's some unique aspects associated with Melchizedek, and Jesus also had many unique aspects associated to his priesthood. I like this image of Melchizedek that we find in some of the temple art of the time, or iconography. It shows Melchizedek the priest, and he is holding some bread and wine. So in addition to the priestly duties associated with the Jewish cult, here we have Melchizedek, who is almost foreshadowing a communion. It says in the book of Genesis, when Abram is greeted by Melchizedek, that Melchizedek blessed Abram and offered him bread and wine. And Abram gave tithes to this mysterious Melchizedek. So this goes back to Genesis 14, when Abram returns from defeating a king that I've abbreviated to Chedro. It's a longer name than that. Meets another king, and then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, which is an old name for Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine and blessed Abraham. And the text says he gave him tithes from all. The text is rather ambiguous. From just looking at the text, you wouldn't know who's giving what to whom. But the writer of our lesson indicates that the typical interpretation is that Abram is giving tithes to Melchizedek the priest. These are the caves at Qumran on the Dead Sea. And inside these various caves are where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1945. You know, there was a long history of scholars who had possession of these scrolls not sharing them with the outside world. It wasn't until 1965 that many of the scrolls were translated and made available to scholars to study. And in addition to various copies of Old Testament books, there are many other writings not in the Old Testament which are also preserved in these Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them are orders of worship and ways to practice discipleship of this community in Qumran. And so in 1965 there were publication of these scrolls that had particular content relating to Melchizedek, who was seen as a great hero in the Essene community. So this reinforces the notion that the Hebrews preacher is concentrating on Melchizedek because these followers were trying to remain in the Jewish fold and not making a full commitment to Christian discipleship. And so the writer said, that's not good. You're holding back. You're holding to an older way that's been superseded by a better covenant. So in 1965, the publication of these Qumran 11, Cave 11, Essene document, Melchizedek is the dominant figure. He's presented as a dominant figure in the judgment and salvation at the end times. You know, we could do a study on end times, and I'm in the church, and I'm sure people would be very interested in it. Anytime you're dealing with what's going to happen in the end times and scripture associated with that, people find that very interesting. So that is why there was a huge interest in this document from the Dead Sea Scrolls, talking so much about Melchizedek. The Cave 11 document presents the Old Jerusalem, one branch of priests called the Zadokite priests, as leaders in the Essene community at Qumran. And the Broadman commentator devotes 4 full pages to the brief text that we have in our lesson today, talking about the significance of Melchizedek and in Essene Judaism. And he is emphasizing what I have said from the beginning, that perhaps many of the early Christians were seeking solace and refuge in their previous religion as a way to escape the persecution that new Christians were facing. We're going to look at this permanence of Jesus starting in Hebrews 7, which the Broadman commentator says is really the focal point and the dramatic center of the whole book is found in chapter 7. Let me read these verses in chapter 7, verses 15 through 19. It is even more obvious when another priest arises, resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest, not through a legal requirement concerning physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life. For it is attested of him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. There is, on the one hand, the abrogation of an earlier commandment, because it was weak and ineffectual, for the law made nothing perfect. There is, on the other hand, the introduction of a better hope, through which we approach God. So the writer is talking about a new priest forever, not out of the line of the Levites, not out of the line of Zadok, or who was the son of Abram, but a new priest, more like Melchizedek, which is Jesus. So Jesus is mentioned as a new permanent priest, kind of like in the form of Melchizedek. In verses 18 to 19, Jesus' high priesthood came not by physical descent or specification of the law, but through the power of an indestructible life, which I'm calling the exaltation of God. God exalted Jesus to the highest of heavens. Jesus proceeded through the heavens, and he became a high priest by the power, direct power of God, not through his earthly descent from one of the tribes of Judah, or through an appointment by man. So the priesthood of Jesus is seen as far superior and permanent compared to these other priests. The law was weak and ineffectual. At its best, it just temporarily sought connection with God. But Jesus provides a better hope through which we have permanent access to God. So, the high priesthood of Jesus is not validated by the law, but by the power of Jesus' own indestructible life. So Jesus was appointed or exalted by an oath of God. So the appointment of Jesus as our great high priest had much more power and rigor than the earthly priests before him. The unstated objection that is refuted by the Hebrews preacher in these verses is that there could be no greater priesthood than the Levitical priesthood through the tribe of Levi. But the Hebrews preacher is saying, no, that's not the case. There are other examples, including the priesthood of Melchizedek. But the Hebrews preacher said that pales in significance to the permanent high priesthoods of Jesus. It's worth noting, the Broadman commentator says at this point, that the Sadducees did not even believe in the resurrection. So they would not have accepted the resurrection of Jesus as a great high priest. So we need to get outside the Jewish first covenant and see the power of Jesus in the second covenant demonstrated by our faithfulness to Jesus. So let's move on and read the eternal intercessor that we have described further on in the book of Hebrews. Verses 20 through 25 says, "This was confirmed with an oath, for others who became priests took their office without an oath. But this one became a priest with an oath, because of the one who said to him, 'The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever.' Accordingly, Jesus has also become the guarantee of a better covenant. Furthermore, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able for all time to save those who approach God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them." So Jesus is our eternal intercessor. It's not periodic, it's not temporary as in other high priests. His is eternal. Jesus obtained this position not through an oath that like the previous high priests obtained, but Jesus was sworn by God as a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantee of a better covenant. Jesus' priesthood is permanent because he continues forever, not like other earthly priests who live and die. Jesus always lives to intercede and save all who approach God through him. These are wonderful promises and present Jesus as our eternal intercessor, making him far superior to any earthly priest, including the celebrated Melchizedek. Again, there are some once appearing words in our text today. One of the challenges in studying the book of Hebrews is you almost need a dictionary as you go through it. Even if you are basically familiar with the Greek text, there are words that appear only one time. Sometimes you can figure out from the context what they mean, but there are at least two words that appear only one time in today's text which center on this idea of the permanence of Jesus. And the first one is there in 7:16, akataludos, permanent, perpetual. So Jesus is going on forever, and that is analogous, or that supplements or complements the word that appears down in verse 24, erparabatos, which is permanent or unchangeable. So he's perpetual, permanent, unchangeable. Talking about Jesus and not about any of the other high priests. So let's look at 26 through 28, which indicates Jesus as the perfect priest forever. It's almost like our Hebrew equivalent of poetical parallelism. The writer is saying the same thing, slightly altered, but repeating it for emphasis. These verses say, "For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests those who are subject to weakness, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So this high priest Jesus is holy, blameless, undefiled, and separate, and exalted by God in some special way that we don't understand fully or that does not apply to any other priest. Jesus has no need to continually offer sacrifices for his own sins and for the sins of others, like the high priests of old. In other words, before the old priests could go in and even do their priestly task in the Holy of Holies, they had to offer for their own sins. But Jesus had no sin, so he wasn't subject to that limitation or requirement. Priests appointed through the law are subject to weakness, but God's oath appointed a son who is perfect forever. When God appoints you, no other authority is needed. That is a perfect measure forever. So the high priesthood of Jesus is one that makes intercession for us continually. I like this quote from the Broadman commentator who says, "If Christ has no higher work in heaven than to pray for others, what greater work on earth can people do than to pray for others?" This is why I love Sunday school so much. We always lift up those in need, and I'm hoping that this week we have special needs in members of our church, and that you will offer up those who are grieving, those who are hurting, those who have physical problems, and do our part to minister and be a priest to the limit of our capacity to our fellow believers, recognizing that we are imitating the perfect priesthood of Jesus, who is doing that for us continually. So the Broadman commentator offers a 7-point sermon on these verses that we've read today, entitled "The Perfect Priesthood of Jesus." It was by divine appointment, not by human appointment that we get in verses 14 and 15. It's based upon his indestructible life forever. Jesus has moved on through the resurrection to the heavenlies in verses 16 through 19. It was made through an oath of God, not through any oath of men, verses 20 through 21. It's based on a better covenant, verse 22. His high priesthood is perpetual, goes on and on and on. It doesn't stop, requiring a rejuvenation. He offers absolute salvation continually in verse 25, and he has unique personal qualifications, such as he listens to us, he was without sin. And so this makes the perfect priesthood of Jesus from this chapter 7 in the book of Hebrews, which can be seen as the focal point to the whole book. I used this in the Sunday school class on Sunday and got pretty favorable response. In other words, people said, "I haven't seen this before. I'd like for you to print this out and give me copies of this." So I'm going to do that this year. But I'm indicating that in Hebrews we could talk about the words and deeds of Jesus or his life tradition. And there were early churches that followed the life tradition of Jesus more than any other. And this is what I prefer, because we can read about Jesus in the Gospels, and his words and deeds provide a pattern for us in our discipleship and daily life. Others want to focus more on the death tradition or Jesus' suffering and sacrifice. I don't dispute that. I don't find fault with that. To me, the life tradition is more instructive for things that I can do. And then we talk about the Easter event of resurrection, Jesus' ascension to heaven, or his exaltation even beyond heaven. And I believe the writer of Hebrews, the Hebrews preacher, is seeking to present Jesus in his full exaltation. That very highest credit goes to Jesus. And he puts a lot of theology or philosophical content on that, which some people find helpful. I find focusing on the words and deeds of Jesus associated with his life tradition is more useful. But it all fits together and helps paint a picture of Jesus as the permanent high priest. So here's some questions for your classroom or for your individual study. Have you ever seen anyone abandon their Christian faith? I mentioned two people here which are very sad stories. Bertrand Russell, the famous Lord Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, and Bart Ehrman, who is he's still alive, who is a professor of religion at the University of North Carolina. I have many of his books, and both of these people claim not to be Christians or not to be Christian anymore. And the funny thing is, it's not because they face persecution, it's because they intellectually don't subscribe to Christian belief anymore. What a sad thing. I have high hopes that Bart Ehrman will come back to the faith, but we never know. In what sense is a never-changing God bad news? Is it only good news? I hear people say all the time, "Oh, God never changes." It's really a wonderful thing. What we mean by that when we say God never changes is his standards or his measuring sticks or how we're judged never changes. But we want God to change. We want God to interact with us. We want there to be a time when we weren't interacting with God, and then there's a time when we are interacting with God. That's a change. So I like the idea of God changing in some respect to acknowledge us, to deal with us, to help us. If God never changes, then you have the deistic idea of God that was prominent in the Enlightenment period, where God just dwells above the heavens and doesn't get involved. If God's not involved with us, that's bad news. That requires some change. I affirm the idea that God doesn't arbitrarily change and change the way he looks at us, though. But you may have ideas about that. This is really good for a Sunday school discussion. And what are some of the things we can give up or give away in response to what Jesus has done for us? Jesus continually intercedes for us, is our high priest at all time. This calls upon us to do something, to acknowledge that. Not that we earn the right for that, but that out of gratitude we can make the world better. At this time of year where we have our offering for mission offerings and for our coffee offering for the downtown homeless center that we have every year. We're gathering items for the Christmas boxes that we have for the poor counties in Kentucky. These are small things we can do, things that we can give up or give away, which reflects the change that we've experienced in our life. So these are all good. Maybe I'm hopeful that you can name some more things as well. Here's pictures of Bertrand Russell, who passed away, and Bart Ehrman. I have over a dozen of Bart Ehrman's books. He is a very clear writer, very smart. He went to Moody Bible Institute. That was his first school after high school. At the Moody Bible Institute, they pride themselves on knowing the Bible. The Bible is our middle name. He was very conservative, evangelical. Then he went to Wheaton College, of all places. It's where Billy Graham went to further his education. So I think he kind of regrets, in some sense, doing that, because that exposed him to other ideas. And then finally, he went to the Princeton Theological Seminary for his doctoral work. And there is where he kind of fell off the wagon. So Moody Bible, Wheaton College, Princeton Theological Seminary. And now he claims not to be a believer. You can read Bertrand Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian. I read it every couple of years, and it's frightening to think that there are people who brag about not being a Christian. All we can do is pray for him. Here's the title of one of Bert Ehrman's books with a kind of a presumptuous title, God's Problem. God doesn't have problems. We have problems. All the problems are here. Heaven's in good shape. So this leads you to believe that Bart is not dealing honestly with some of his issues. But anyway, these are books that you might want to look at that relate to the lesson today. So again, thank you for joining me. Don't take me too seriously. You know, I'm well intentioned in my actions here, but I don't speak for any denomination. I don't speak for the church, or my views are not endorsed by any seminary or college. It's just one person's view, and what you think are equally valid to my views. But do remember our prayer concerns. Use your Sunday school time to huddle together and join voices, lift up those who are in need of prayer this week. So we'll see you next week. We have a new study, a new unit next week that's from another book, the book of Ruth, and I think we're going to find it quite interesting. Again, a shout out to Daryl Elster, who is so instrumental in everything we do here at the church. Thank you, Daryl, for all your help. So, thank you for joining me this time. We'll see you next week.